Hello everybody, this is Havoc and welcome to the Victoria 3 Q&A session video. I decided to kind of do this live, sort of like how I do my Victoria Developer Diary series, and I just got my new ugly Christmas sweater featuring a wonderful cow getup. I will show you just real quick. All of its glory. So I figured this would be the perfect time to show it off. So for those of you who don't know, if you subscribe to the newsletter in Victoria 3, they just had a kind of a Ask Me Anything Q&A session where people who had the right code were able to log into the session, were able to post their questions, and the developers themselves were able to answer to, obviously, the best of their abilities. Now, I will say we're not going to go through all of these at all because there's quite a few of them, but we will handle quite a lot because there are hundreds of questions that were answered in this short period of time. And it's a great way to get some insight into the game that, you know, you can't really get from developer diaries or things that just haven't really been thought about. And several of these questions that I'm noticing are indeed along that scale, just kind of things, oh, well, that's a cool scenario. What happens if this happens? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going, as you can see behind me, that the answers to all the questions that were asked are just going to be up on the screen. And I will kind of, you know, skip through and go through all this, obviously cut out all the fluff, cut out all the things that aren't necessary. But the basic goal here is for you, the community, to get an idea, better idea of different aspects of the game. Now, before we begin, as always, if you enjoy any part of this video or want to support the channel in any way, you can give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on bell notifications, and of course, leave your comments. This will be a rather lengthy video because I will cover all the questions that I find interesting or applicable. So let's dive right on in. Now, one of the most interesting questions right off the bat is this one right here. Well, some cultures have areas that they specialize in. For example, Nepali could be better soldiers while Norwegians could be better fishermen. And the main problem that Michael has with that is that the unfortunate implications of saying people are just innately better at one thing or another. A Norwegian who moves to central Iowa isn't going to be a terribly good fisherman, and a Nepali who has never experienced war in his or her lifetime isn't going to have much experience at combat. This is fantastic because, as we know, or as we've seen, and maybe you haven't seen, that pops are a result of their circumstances. Yes, you have this idea of a national identity, but as they said, with the ability to migrate or different situations coming up, a Nepali soldier or a Nepali pop may never experience war. It just may never happen. So naturally, they're not going to be natural soldiers. And again, with the Norwegians, if you are a Norwegian and you move to Iowa and you become a farmer, you're not going to know how to fish. So the idea of putting these inherently or innately, as they mentioned, traits within a certain people just doesn't work in the nature of Victoria 3. And it was a very good question to lead off this video with because it gives you that sense of pops are a result of their circumstances. They aren't Americans, so they're just naturally good at this, or they're French, so they're naturally good at cheese tasting or things of that nature. It just doesn't affect the pops that way in the traditional, I guess, sense that maybe other strategy games employ. So we've already known this, but one of the hardest changes that the team had to take on with the usual grand strategy games formula was strategic warfare. Something we've had to redesign, rework, and iterate on numerous times during the course of development, and why it's not finished yet. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, including art assets. That's the very basic level. But the mechanics themselves, as they mentioned, aren't completely fleshed out. They're not balanced. There's still a lot of work that has to be done to figure them out in their completeness, which is good. That's good to know that they recognize it and that they're able to still want to focus on it and realize the importance of what needs to change to make it more strategic and not tactical. Next up, what are the effects of war to infrastructure? Is it possible for some buildings and railways to get damaged? Their response is, again, one of those things that I didn't really think about, but comes together very nicely. War doesn't damage the buildings or railways directly, but it does inflict devastation. We've seen that in the developer diary, which impacts how the existing building functions. After the war, this devastation will dissipate gradually as the country rebuilds. They did it this way to ensure that players wouldn't need to keep track of everything that's been destroyed during the war and rebuild it manually, and also creates a better record, quote unquote, of how badly a state has been affected, so it's apparent where there's the most amount of damage has been inflicted, excuse me. I like this approach because in so many other games and, Total War, even other Paradox Grand Strategy games, you have to figure out what's going on in a place that you just conquered, or when a war's over with, you have to spend some time figuring out how to make everything better again. Instead, the devastation level affects the impact of it, and there are different ways to increase the rate of decrease in devastation. Basically, there are things you can do to make sure that you recover from that devastation faster. And so if you take over a state that's had a severe amount of devastation, but you took over it because it had a lot of infrastructure or a lot of buildings, then you are going to have an incentive to look after the ways to remove the devastation instead of figuring out, okay, well, I got to jot a note down over here saying, hey, you've got 15 buildings destroyed, all these industries are in ruins, and your railways, you're going to need to rebuild them. Instead, it's just lowering down that devastation level where it becomes a functional piece of that territory again. We've got one on kind of the political side. Can oppressed cultures try and attempt to revolt against their oppressors? Oppressed cultures can seek to revolt and create their own national identity, but they can also seek migration depending on the situation. A couple important things to think about here regarding pops and obviously their cultures therein, in that pops will more often than not chase the easiest route to become the wealthiest, the fastest. If they are oppressed and they don't have a terrible sense of national identity, then they probably will find an easier time migrating to find a better job, a place where they aren't feeling that oppression. Now, if they do have a sense of national identity to the area, they will probably stay in and become discontent. So there's multiple pathways here, and it depends, of course, on the situation of the pops, just like with the Nepali versus the Norwegian, in that, yes, there's the possibility that they will rise up and revolt, but if it is a more simpler process, if it is easier for them to migrate to another country where they don't receive that oppression, even potentially at the cost of a little bit of a lower wealth, I imagine they would rather do that than go through the possibility of, hey, revolting and, oh, hey, dying. Makes sense. It's also good that we can form nations like Scandinavia. This wasn't anything that I was too terribly concerned about. We see several countries where this sort of unification happens, and we've seen even in several other questions in this answers Discord channel where you have certain events that will trigger to form these united nations, not the United Nations in our regard, but a nation of united smaller countries, such as Germany. There's an event chain, as well as Austria-Hungary, etc., etc. So it's good to see that. Nothing I didn't not expect, though. This is another fantastically good political style question, something I hadn't considered about, but is answered very well. Will nations automatically turn socialist or communist once they get trade unions, interest groups? I keep forgetting what I want to say Instagram. Once they come into power, like in Victoria 2, where Russia suddenly becomes the Soviet Union, or do the trade unions have to pass specific laws to get there? The answer for that is that trade unions aren't inherently communist, and communism isn't inherently trade unions. And it's not just a matter of being in government. You have to actually pass communist laws to be a communist country. Typically, trade unions are kind of aligned with communism, more with socialism, I would say, in the idea that everyone is represented fairly, or that everyone gets sort of an equal amount of pay. So it's nice to know that as a democratic country, I can support trade unions and not inherently go just default to kind of a communist style government. It also means that by passing laws, I have to intentionally go into communism. And I imagine intentionally go into democracy, intentionally go into socialism, things of that nature. there's lots of things that have to be passed. There are certain technologies such as nationalism, which I've seen in this answers thing, that have to be passed to be able to do things like enact certain military laws, things of that nature. But it's good to know that we won't just see this progression of, oh, hey, now that these people are in power, well, crap, now we just have to go into communism. There is a way to fight that, and there is a way to purposefully enable that if you so choose. So it's a very good question. I'm really glad they asked it. We haven't talked a lot about modding because that hasn't been something that's really been brought up in the overall scope of the game. But any interesting new modding capabilities compared to CK3 that are planned or that you can share? And Martin comes in with a major addition is the ability to mod AI strategies that govern all sorts of AI behavior, like which specific land it wants to conquer, which goods and buildings it wants to focus on, which politics it favors, and so on. Now, there will be a dev diary on this at some other point, so I don't want to go into a huge amount of speculation, but it is really cool to see that we're going to be able to mod personalities, because that's essentially what it comes down to. Is the person in power for the country will kind of have a goal for that country, and to see it specced out and to be able to give an AI, say, hey, I want you to try and become militaristic, so they will focus on that. Something I don't believe we've truly really seen a terrible amount, at least not in the implications and the modding availability from previous games. This is a fantastic quality of life feature where we see models of trains move around railways on the map. They go choo-choo if we zoom in close enough. Now, the trains do indeed travel around the map and go choo-choo. In fact, the trains even go chugga-chugga. Now, we've seen in CK3 a lot of the audio implementations into the game, in Crusader Kings 3, mind you, where there's loads of layers and layers that have different event triggers that pile on top of each other. Fantastic. I would love to know more about the audio progression in Victoria 3, because in Crusader Kings 3, it's great. So it seems like we're going to see the same thing here. If you have a lot of infrastructure based on railways, your trains are going to be seen, they're going to be visible, they're going to go choo-choo, we're going to see steam coming out of them. But on top of that, we're able to zoom in far enough, we're going to be able to hear that chugga-chugga, as it were. And it's going to be just a really cool quality of life feature, because it gives life to a map that otherwise might be a little more stagnant. Victoria 2 doesn't have a fantastic amount of movement or animation. Next up, how will you integrate real historical flavor, which that means by decisions, events, music, artwork, and options for alternate historical events and timelines. Now, we have Paradox has an event about Karl Marx, writing the Communist Manifesto, but maybe Marx is a child or dead by the point that the Communist Manifesto has been written, or maybe socialism first emerged in Borneo, in which case someone else will write the Communist Manifesto. This is really cool because it means they have a form of scripted events that I'm sure will be explained at later dates. And in fact, they will be, because it's mentioned in one of these questions and answers. But they aren't quite so much scripting it so hard where Karl Marx himself is born. Karl Marx himself at age X writes the Communist Manifesto, and it leads into several event chains. No, instead it's the idea, it's the book and the ideology that is scripted in, but it can trigger at different times because Karl Marx isn't going to be guaranteed to be alive. Or he may be born at a little bit of different time, depending on XXX if this happens. So to see that we have more ideals, or the larger picture is scripted in place, the actual event itself can trigger at random times under different circumstances in different countries, is awesome. What if the Communist Manifesto occurred in America or Canada or some other place in Africa? To see the results of that would be really cool, and again adds that idea of historical accuracy in a sense, but also a player triggered alternate timeline. Now, this is a question I expected to be asked, and I think several people did ask it. How steep do you expect the learning curve for this game to be? Relatively easy for a non-grand strategy player to pick up like CK3, or more towards Vicky 2? And it's not an easy answer. Now, it's hard to judge what the learning curve of the game will be because there are multiple types of players. I do expect that this game will be one of the more difficult learning curves to someone not accustomed to Paradox style games. It should be more approachable to someone who's familiar with Paradox due to our works on tooltips and tutorials. It should be easily understandable for those who consider themselves experts on Victoria 2. That's not me at all. However, their goal is to make the game as approachable as possible without making it any less detailed. It's a hard ask, but it's possible to set large-scale actions and policies and get by, but then there's also the further economic detail and min-maxing you can partake if you want. I think one of the best moves that Paradox has made in recent years is making their user interface approachable. The user interface transition from Crusader Kings 2 to Crusader Kings 3 is nothing short of remarkable, and it's one of the best features that drew me in initially, and it's why I have such a deep love for Crusader Kings 3, because I see that from a new player, I was able to learn the game without being completely and utterly 1000% lost. And I feel like the same thing is going to be approachable from Victoria 2 to Victoria 3. While the user interface could use a little bit of help, we're a long ways off from release. I think that the difference in the user interface between the two games will bring in outside players who were scared to look at Vicky 2 because it was a spreadsheet simulator. They will come in and see Victoria 3 as something that's very approachable. It looks good. It's got some animation to it. It looks modern and will automatically bring people in. But at the same time, the integration of tooltips, tutorials means that if someone's lost, if they do the same thing as they did with Victoria 3, they'll be able to find most of their answers without any worries or concerns. And that's great. And it does so much for both Paradox and the community because it brings in a flood of new players who don't have to know everything about Vicky 2 or grand strategy games from Paradox in general in order to pick it up. And that is crucial, crucial, crucial. Now we move on to a little bit of some government actions. How does the government form affect how laws pass? Does an absolute monarchy like Prussia have an easier time to pass unpopular laws by many interest groups than a constitutional monarchy like Great Britain? Now, more authoritarian laws will help you pass laws faster. So an autocratic monarchy that suppresses opposition interest groups can pass laws quickly and with less resistance than a democracy with a strong opposition. Of course, that has its own downsides. Those downsides are obviously going to be a form of discontent among that interest group, and depending on the interest group's clout, will also depend on the rebelliousness of pups, their willingness to go along with any further laws, and obviously the idea that they can turn radical and then form rebellions. So yes, in an authoritarian state, you can pass laws quicker. You don't have so much of the debate, the haggling, the yays or the nays, but you'll have some different side effects that maybe might not be worth it. Another great question, considering the old school style of Victoria 2 and how it represented different countries. Will the African continent be better detailed? In the last Vicky 2 borders, followed along colonial lines, which didn't make sense and gave them a sense of only existing as filler states. Since Victoria 3 has the concept of decentralized nations, which is not there in Victoria 2, we're able to model a larger number of such countries on, for example, the African continent. The only empty space in Africa is now inhospitable, impassable regions, like the Deep Sahara, and all other parts have countries, resources, and pops. The borders is another matter because Vicky 3 has fixed state region borders, although the states within a region can be mutable. We've had to draw those lines somewhere, and to ensure it's possible to end up with a historical map, we have in some cases had to draw the lines along colonial borders. Now this is a little bit unfortunate, but it's the idea that decentralized states, not that they weren't sophisticated enough to have their own borders. I don't want to say that because it's not true at all. Many of the decentralized nations simply just didn't have the political power to push back against the colonial superpowers of Europe. But what we have here is basically we have decentralized nations who work on their own, but the overall state regions, and we've talked about these regions before, they're kind of more set in stone. So for instance, the United States will probably look like the United States of today by the end of it because the state regions are the way they are. And kind of the only way to make it work, from the way it sounds anyways, is that they had to make the state regions in Africa, for example, follow more along colonial borders, but it's the borders within the state regions that can be a little more malleable. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that kind of looks like if we ever get around to it. One of the features that I'm really excited about, and they are asking if they're just excited, is diplomatic plays. Diplomatic plays have the potential to really shake up the system, in that it's kind of a game of bluffing, and especially when it comes to multiplayer, where you have a bunch of humans who are trying to push things. I'm really looking forward to watching some multiplayer. I probably won't partake too much, because even if I have all these things nailed down, it won't be that great for me, I don't feel. But seeing how diplomatic plays will play out, where they're the human players, what they kind of do either in chat or through whatever means to say, hey, go do this and I'll join you. If you add this certain war objective, I'll join you. Or, hey, you know what? What's his face over here is offering me this. If I join him, I'm undecided. What can you do for me? There's a lot of political play in diplomatic plays, and it just creates a really unique ecosystem centered around how to approach war that I'm really, really eager to see play out. And even from single player standpoint, it's going to be great. But I'm really, really excited to see how it plays out in multiplayer, and they clearly are too. A quick little thing, how many nations will be playable at launch? Will there possibly be more playable nations in coming DLCs? On release anyways, all of them except for decentralized nations will be playable. That's a lot. That's a lot. Every single nation that is decentralized. And I expect also to be making map revisions in the future that will add more countries to the map. So this is a thing that Paradox always has done. They've done it Crusader Kings 3. They've done it with all other games that I can think of off the top of my head, in that we will have additions to maps. We'll have additions to borders. Things might change. We might break up some countries into some smaller countries if there's historical evidence to support it. Things of that nature. So it's unfortunate. I really wanted to play as a decentralized nation, and I kind of wonder why we can't play as a decentralized nation. But regardless, we'll be able to play as every other nation. It's just the standard policy of Paradox to have everything playable, even if everything isn't fleshed out. So you may be able to play as a really small country, but your mechanics may be basic. You may not have unique faction trees or things of that nature. But regardless, there's going to be a lot of playable nations at launch. Good to see. Regarding some war things, is war support calculated for each war individually or all wars a country is involved in? So for example, if I'm Austria fighting Russian for Poland and things aren't going great and I'm at 50% war support, if Italy then declares on me for Venice, do I start at 50 war support in that war or 100% war support? Now, war support is calculated individually per war. Though doing badly in one war can definitely result in your war support going down faster in another. Factors such as your population being starving and miserable as a result of one war will impact the other. I think it's important to note here, and specifically Warboss's statement about multiple wars, in that the war goal of each individual war has a heavy determination on how quickly war support is affected, both at the beginning and as it trickles down throughout the war. It's more likely to start at 100% war support for every war you get dragged into. However, as they mentioned, your stability of your government will play a part in how much war support you get at the beginning. And then of course it will affect a lot more down the road. Now I will say this, if Austria is fighting Russia for Poland and Russia takes the capital in those war goals, obviously Austria is going to start tanking war support in that war. But I would imagine that Italy then could never get Austria to go below 0 war support because of the conditions where you have to have the war goals as well as the capital in order to really tank things to a negative war support. There are conditions in which war support goes below 0% into the negatives to then force a capitulation. And if another nation holds those regions, then I imagine you wouldn't be able to take it, and therefore things wouldn't go good for Italy in this instance until Russia has their way with Austria. So just something to think about. When you're in multiple wars, it's going to vary differently, and it may even work in your favor if you're losing in one war, because maybe a nation can't conquer what they need to, and they won't decrease in that war support. When it comes to the economy, this is a really intriguing question, and I'm not entirely sure how to interpret it, although I'll do my best. What's the most interesting aspect, consequence of anything you've already talked about that you were not able to place onto a dev diary? And Michael answers this, says, I don't actually recall if we discussed urbanization in detail, but one aspect I find fascinating is how building up your industrial states automatically creates a parallel service industry, which booms if the pop's wealth increases, but fails if it doesn't. So creating an exploitative, extractive industrial sector will decrease the price of industrial output goods in the market, but not benefit any sector of pops in that state. So essentially what you have, so say, I don't know, say you have some wealthy pops who want fine furniture and they want glass. I'm throwing this out there. What you can do is you have all the raw resources in that region. So you are able to then produce the fine furniture and all the glass you want. Now, because you are able to provide so much, the cost of that good goes down, which means it makes it even more accessible for the pops there. But if those pops don't increase in wealth, then the value of those service industries that they are creating specifically to service those wealthy pops doesn't go up. If those pops fail, that industry fails. If those pops go into a even better standard of living that's still within the luxury bracket of fine furniture and glass, then that industry booms because more people are coming in. It increases the cost of the goods overall. So it's a weird sort of tie-in where the fine furniture and glass isn't benefiting the pop because the fine furniture and glass doesn't actually increase their wealth. It's a requirement for that pop's wealth, right? So it's not a way where the industry is benefiting the pop. It's a weird situation, but I see where he's coming from, and it creates a different approach than what I think I've ever really tried to wrap my head around, in that it is completely, that service industry is completely dependent on the success of its pops without actually contributing to the pop's lifestyle outside of being a requirement for that current pop's wealth. Does that make sense? It can't increase, the pops can't increase in wealth because of the services, but the services are reliant on the pops increasing their own wealth through other means. Hopefully that answers it. Next up, will it be possible to release countries that are part of bigger countries and then switch and play as them? And it is possible for the player to forego a mandate of a larger multi-ethnic empire and retire to the safe and comforting rule of a small, newly established independent nation or subsequent subject polity under the hands of the AI. So in short, yes, you certainly can. I'm sure this will either be for, you know, specific historic scenarios that you want to try and create, or if you just want to see if you can create an empire, then break it apart and start all over. It's good to see that we can do that, even though it's a little weird. And then also along that line, right underneath it, will it be possible for Austria to unify Germany? Yes, it will, but only if they don't become Austria-Hungary. So there are different nation event chains that will occur under certain circumstances, in which case you can create these larger nations. Going back to war, would we be able to control the country's war doctrine, and by that, control how our generals approach war? Now, they're not talking about microing the generals, but more along the general strategy that they will take. And they've sort of answered this in the developer diary, but the approach we've taken is that the player's in charge of which generals to hire, promote, and retire. And the traits those generals have will affect how they approach war in various ways. You can also customize how your army behaves through some tech and production methods, and determine the broad composition of your army via the army model laws, all things that we've discussed so far in dev diaries. Aside from that, some sort of overall countrywide doctrine that affects how your wars progress is not currently in the plan, but also not ruled out for the future if we want to add even more agency. It's something we think would fit well within our approach. So again, this isn't the idea of microing your armies. Remember, we are talking about strategic warfare and not tactical warfare. However, being able to set sort of doctrines of, hey, if this, then do this, scenarios would be great. But again, that's also up to what generals you hire and why it's important to hire them, retire them, or try and move them along to different sectors of life. Because one war may be very defensive, in which you have a superior defensive general, but another war you may not need a defensive one, and you need to figure out what to do with them in order to make space for this offensive one that you're trying to get in. So I like it. I think having a little more introduction regarding war doctrines would be good. I think it's pretty historically accurate as well, in that the leader of the country can largely determine how the war goes, but it is up to the generals to actually execute it. Now, we haven't gone into events, although there is a plan developer diary focusing on events themselves. So this question up above is a great one. Will there be assassinations in the game that might result in earlier changes of the head of state for the country? For example, there had been multiple attempts on both Kaiser Wilhelm and Queen Victoria, and we will definitely have political assassinations, which means that you, as the player and the head of your country, can politically assassinate people to maybe trigger wars or to get rid of some pesky interest groups. There's lots of implications for this one, because it does mean that you can play the sort of war profiteering exploitative, where you could, I assume if you had a good spy master, whatever the equivalent is, you could assassinate a highly public character that could trigger a war between two nations, both of whom maybe you have okay relations with, but also you export goods to. Therefore, by creating that assassination and triggering that war, you make a lot of money. Political assassinations have a lot of things about them, and I'm glad that we'll see them. Maybe we'll get our own little diary focusing on it, or something of that nature that answers questions just a little bit better. Kind of riding on the curtails of that political question, will every major political decision require some sort of political approval, or will there be unilateral choices like releasing nations in HOI4, EU4, or passing laws in Stellartis? Now, not everything requires approval and consensus, but that doesn't mean it isn't without consequence. And we saw that up above earlier, I should say, where they were just like, hey, can I pass these laws if I'm authoritarian? The answer is yes, you'll be able to do it, but there will be negative sides to it. So it may be wise in more cases than not to push the political agenda a little bit, maybe wait a little bit longer, a year or two, to get something approved, to remove the possibilities of an interest group coming in and causing a lot of issues. Now, will there be a tutorial like in CK3? Victoria 3 will be the first game in the Vicky series that this person's playing, so a tutorial like in CK3 would be a huge help and much appreciated. And they are indeed working on one. They're working on it hard, and in the format will have similarities to CK3. We're of course aiming to improve on it and make many of our own changes to fit more along Victoria 3 rather than Crusader Kings 3. One change we've been aiming for is you'll be able to play the tutorial as any country, but we're not going into specific details on that yet. Now, as a UX designer, the tutorial is close to Heavy Claudica's heart, since it's one of the most important features, especially for a new player's experience. I concur. Goodness, words are hard. I concur 100%. It was the UI UX additions from Crusader Kings 3 that drew me in and allowed me to learn the game. And again, as I mentioned already, one of the best features of Crusader Kings 3. So to see that they have a tutorial in mind, that it's in the works, not only that, but that it is at a very deep level for this UX designer is great. And it just makes me more excited to see what the tutorial is going to be about. This is an interesting one, and it's one that I kind of had in the back of my mind that really came to the forefront once this question was read by myself. Will there be some way to peacefully resolve diplomatic plays by offering a compromise? At the moment, there is only backing down, but Martin is considering negotiated solutions along the same principles as peace deals. It's more complicated because factors such as limited timer nature of plays, compared to the wars. So we'll see. I think this would be good. I think if you are able to compromise a little bit in some ways, maybe as the aggressor, offer a compromise, or even as the defender, once a certain stage is hit, being like, okay, well, I'll back out if this happens. Instead of it being so one-sided, because I think there's definitely a lot of room to have that ability to compromise even before a war completely starts. Now we're going to get into technology in this next developer diary, so this one has a little bit of relevance, and I'm glad that it was asked. Will there be world fairs to show off to other nations? World fairs are represented in-game as events and decisions, with greater payoffs for countries at the bleeding edge of technological progresses. World fairs have the potential to shape the world, in my opinion, and in fact they did in many, many cases. To see that we are going to get that in some form or another is great to see, and I'm very eager to know exactly how that all will work out. But seeing everything I have so far, I have no doubts that it will work out quite well. With 3D characters, do you intend for their clothing to evolve over time? Clothing and uniforms from 1836 to 1870, 1900 and 1930 looked very different. Be nice to see them evolve with time. For release, unfortunately, we won't be able to explore the evolution of fashions over this time period. Instead, just going to aim for clothes which are as broadly suitable as possible. Though it would be cool to see clothing change over time. Personally, would love to see it in. Modding more clothing for specific circumstances is certainly doable though. And I think that's going to be the answer. And in this case, with Paradox, I think kind of relying on the modding community isn't a cop-out so much as I think with other franchises. In this regard specifically, you know, the community flavor pack for a Victoria 3 would be great and I think would work perfectly. But in this case, I wonder if it's just a dedication of too many assets and too much time for the designers themselves to have to worry about, okay, well, at this point, this is where fashion evolves. Same here, same here, same here. And instead just relying on the community to do that, I think is a great thing. Also just allows people to kind of flex what they want to do and what they can show off, which I think works very well for this game. A fantastic little snippet of accessibility for players, especially colorblind. Is colorblindness considered in the design of the UI? Yes, it is. I can say we've been working towards addressing some colorblindness issues with our game, particularly because it's more numbers heavy than others. We've been working on a dynamic setting that would allow for us to expand its coverage and hopefully, don't confirm, allow for modding as well to help overall various possibilities. Maybe we can do a dev diary in the future. I think that would be awesome. I hope that there is more than one area of accessibility for this game. I do not like any game that limits the player based on certain handicaps or certain accessibility issues that they have that's out of their control. They can't handle it. But every game should be playable by all players. It's a stance that I very, very staunchly for. So I think every single game, especially strategy games, which in many cases might be more easily accessible to the accessibly enabled people, is just a given. I mean, it's a way to open up your community. It's a way to show that you care about your community as a whole, regardless of who they are or what their abilities are or are not. So again, I'm a big staunch supporter of it, and it's good to see they've already considered colorblindness, but also the ability to mod in different other accessibility ways to the game. Sort of on that note, but more quality of life related. What are some of the biggest quality of life changes that are planned or that have been made? Now, there are a lot, but just to take one example, we've implemented prediction functions when you change production method or expand a building for how profitable the method will be. This in itself isn't new, but what is new about it is that the prediction takes into account factors such as how prices are going to change, not just from that particular building, but also from every other building currently in your construction queue. Pop goods substitutions, so you can see if there is potential for a good to be consumed, even if it's not currently consumed, so on and so forth. These predictions are actually also used by the AI to be able to gain far more accurate plans for its economic decisions than in our other games. Good to see. I like it. They're basically taking things that the AI already considers and making it available to the player. Makes sense. Good job. I'm glad to see it. Quality of life changes like that are always going to be a solid yes in my book. Back on to some economic style questions. Will it be possible to have an import-based economy? It's feasible To have an import-based economy, you just need to ensure that your domestic consumption is large enough to sustain the profitability of your other industries, considering their import expenses. It's just as feasible to rule a fully export-based economy, or to specialize as the middleman of being the refinery machining capital of the region or the world. The issue is that you will have to make sure your supply and buying markets are all right with that arrangement, and that theirs and your pop's exchange expectations are met in ways that can force them to change their economic structure. This is something I really want to test in several ways. Can you have an import-only focused economy? Can you have an export-only focused, where you just push all of your goods out, leaving a little bit for your own people, but not enough to really hamper the export value of these different goods? So it's good to see that there are these systems in place. It may be a little more difficult to do, but it's certainly not outside of reason. Excuse me. This is a cool question regarding war. How will special army units like aircrafts and tanks work as opposed to Victoria 2? I have no idea how they work in Victoria 2, so we're just going to go with Victoria 3. And the answer is that they work to support battalions and flotillas. We saw this in the developer diary, which increases their attributes such as attack or defense, scouting, etc., etc., and certain behaviors at the expense of airplanes and tanks constructed in special war machine industries. It's a huge investment, but not one that you can afford not making if you're competing against others who have it. So essentially, once people start kind of producing tanks and aircraft, it will require you to probably suit up and follow suit. But as we saw with certain pieces of your flotillas and your battalions, it's consuming. You have like a special unit division that consumes airplanes and tanks. It's not necessarily represented. If I remember correctly, you know, like your small arms or your heavy arms are a resource that are consumed. So I imagine it's almost the same way here. You have a battalion, a tank division. Their upkeep is consuming tanks or consuming airplanes in a weird sense, but it still works. But as it said there, you're going to have special war machine industries that will produce it. You've got to keep them well supplied. No doubt it's expensive. It is expensive, as they just said, but also it may take some time. You're going to want to have a stockpile to make sure that those can get to the front lines, prepare what's there, etc., etc. But it's almost like airplanes and tanks are kind of like production methods for your own flotillas and your battalion. So yet another one focused on war a little bit. How will a transition from a post-Napoleonic discrete army movement to World War I full front warfare be modeled in game? Remember reading in one of the dev diaries that one of the approaches would include the speed at which fronts change, but is there anything else that's currently being planned? There's a number of different stats that change at different technological tiers that are intended to shape how front lines move over time, how war progresses. We'll get into more details around that once we talk about battles more in depth in the dev diary. The most tangible metric is how much territory changes hands when armies are impacted by different technologies, though. We saw this in that last dev diary, I think with both the peace talks and just battles in general, in that depending on the stances of your generals, depending on the battalion makeup of your armies, etc., etc., the amount of territory that you gain will vary depending on how well they won the war and the technological advances behind it. Obviously, a army that doesn't have any cavalry versus one that does, the one that does will gain more territory that way. You have a detachment of bicycle messengers or the motorcycle troops, or even jeeps and then tanks. You're going to start seeing where that is how wars are going to be more affected, and that devastation is going to get on a grander scale than what we've seen in the the beginning of the game. But also, when you lose a battle, how much territory is lost. And I think that will drastically change wars. It means wars might be on larger fronts as it gets to the late game, but where larger chunks are lost, or maybe depending on technology, maybe shorter chunks of loss, because you got to think, yes, we may have tanks, or we may have, the bicycle people, where they can take large chunks of land, but on the opposite side are machine gunners who have an incredibly great defense and can knock down hundreds of soldiers at once, and in which case that gets kicked back. And so what you might see are these trench lines where 100 yards, however that's represented in the game, is a significant amount of territory to be won. And to be able to capitalize on that and bust through certain lines is going to make the life or death difference, but it all results back to technology. Rolling back to the economic side, how will taxes affect purchasing power and so standard of living? I want to know if I can build a small government for less militancy, for less returns. Without going into extravagant detail about the various disagreements among economic schools on the reflective or the relative effectiveness taxes on consumption, I'm on a character limit, cannot digress. In short, any money taken by taxes will reduce the purchasing power of the pop and make it to where consumption basket is relatively more expensive out of their remaining income. Thus, they will have to reprioritize by possibly consume less. More wealth in their pockets would mean a gradual want of the more quality goods, a nicer standard of living, even something extravagant. But depending on how those taxes are spent, maybe by building industries that stimulate domestic production of the consumed goods you've been importing, which would reduce the cost, therefore make it more obtainable, this loss in purchasing power from one strata of society can be overcome by subsidizing the welfare of another. Nope, it depends, is basically what he's saying. But that does make some decent sense. If you overtax your people, you'll get money from taxes, but you will limit their ability to purchase more expensive goods. However, you take those taxes and you, like they said, make that domestic industry for that good. That good, even with complete market access, as we've talked about with market access, is going to be available to the domestic area first. And if that's the case and will be consumed more, it will lower the price. And because it's more domestically consumed, that cheaper price makes it more attainable for those very pops who just paid too much in taxes to be able to afford it. It's now affordable because it's made domestically. And therefore, they will be able to increase their standard of living, which would then have an effect on how much taxes they give, etc., etc. Now, you could go the other way. You could not tax them as much, which means you wouldn't get quite as much money in. But again, with the way that your debt ceiling and your national treasure ceiling works, you have a lot of wiggle room to invest in industries and make things a little bit cheaper. So say you don't tax them as much, which means they can afford those nicer things earlier. But then it takes a little while longer, but then you start doing that domestic thing in kind of the longer term, or maybe it takes another 10 years. And now suddenly those goods are even less. They still have that standard of living that's really high because you're not taxing them. And now they're able to afford even more, which increase their standard of living even more, which means they do pay a little bit more in taxes, but it also allows them to reinvest back into the economy and stimulate it even better. There's a really lot of great ebb and flow with the economic systems in place, and it's something that I very much have enjoyed learning about and digesting as we've had these developer diaries. And kind of rolling on that, is it possible to stay competitive as an agricultural focused nation? Well, you have to industrialize if you want to keep up with the great powers. Naturally, you're going to want to industrialize. But if you want to play a certain agricultural based nation, I'll just say it, slavery focused United States. I've already seen it in several comments across several videos. What determines staying competitive here may differ from player to player. You can stay as a primarily agricultural based economy and meet the relevant standard of living for your pops. Of course, to expand past that, your domestic restrictions without industrializing would require finding markets for such goods, i.e. importing them. It's a challenge to meet the needs of your pops if they start asking for goods you choose to not produce. Nothing in the economic situation and focus is inherently impossible. It just presents a different set of challenges for you to maintain. So again, it's possible to do it, but you're gonna have to figure out how to import that and also make it sustainable for your country to make money off of it. Because if you're constantly importing non-agricultural things, probably not making a lot of money elsewhere. And honestly, the cost of agricultural goods, unless it's something like opium or maybe coffee, things of that nature, isn't going to be super incredibly wealth driven, which means you're probably going to be operating at a deficit for a good amount of time. I don't know. It'd probably take some good finagling, but again, everything's possible. And again, kind of rolling on economics here. We're wrapping up based on economics is basically where I'm going with it. Is there advantages to both tall and wide play? Will it be advantageous to focus on one big city, building up many different urban areas? In short, yes. Playing tall has its advantages and disadvantages, as does wide. It's more of a question of which problems you want to confront. Playing tall can allow for the benefits and throughput of industrializations to be seen faster. Wider means more accessible resources domestically across your economy, but multiple urban centers will require an infrastructure network to maintain a connection between them and the movement of goods, but a single industrialized capital might become dirty over time and see an increase in mortality. So again, it just depends on how you want to play. Do you want to play tall? Then you will be able to. You just have to figure it out. Do you want to play wide? It's the same thing. I love playing tall because it does present some really unique possibilities. And I just like the idea of being a small nation, or, you know, very small focused, but carrying a big stick. Being able to afford to have a large army to throw your weight around while maintaining a small home country front. Playing wide has its benefits too, being the United States, going west, and, you know, conquering all of that is great and fantastic, but it does result in some infrastructure issues that you'll have to tackle. But it's cool to see that we have such a variety to be able to play the game. And with that, that's the end of what I consider the important questions of the Q&A session. Now, I don't know if it's still relevant. I don't know if you can join just by signing up and receiving a code like we did for all of our Q&A sessions that they did today. But regardless, there's a lot of juicy content in here. Tons of questions were answered. Some were very simple. Some you can tell people aren't watching all the dev diaries or reading all the dev diaries, which is fine. It's not ever required. But they were able to get all their questions, well, all the questions that were answered, I think were answered sufficiently well. And the team did a really positive job of addressing the things that really needed addressing. Some were simple questions. They had simple answers. Others had a character limit, but also answered very in-depth. Victoria 3 is shaping up great. It's just looking good. There's so very few issues that I have with the game. And I've been trying to find them because I don't want to go into this with rose-colored glasses. I want to be able to see the flaws and make an informative, in-depth review that addresses all the positives and the negatives. The team are just so daggum open about it that it's hard to come up with issues that they aren't willing to solve, aren't willing to look into, or things of that nature. But as I mentioned, that's the end of this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was somewhat interesting going through these questions. I hope they do something like this maybe in the spring. We still don't have a release date, obviously. I'm estimating Q3, Q4 of 2022 to kind of pave the way for Crusader Kings 3 to do some stuff, more Stellaris, things of that nature, and allow for new announcements over the summer. But yeah, I will definitely be on top of things like this. I'm glad I did it for myself because it was good to see through what the community is asking, the kind of questions they have, and how this will affect things moving forward. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on bell notifications. I might just sport the very fun and entertaining giant cow Christmas sweater for the foreseeable future, maybe throughout all the winter. So let me know your thoughts about that in the comment section below as well, guys. Thank you again for watching. This is Havoc, and I'm out of here.
Up. Up over the smokestacks rose a promise of a grand tomorrow.